Hi again. Let's go straight into it. Chapter 23. Brendan the Bully and the Breaking News. There are some days that you never ever want to forget, like birthdays and school trip days and adventure days. And there are other days when you want to forget everything that ever happened, like when a bully bullies you, or a grown-up tells you off for doing something you didn't do, or when someone you love the most in the world suddenly dies. And then there are roller coaster days. Those are the days when one moment you're so happy that you feel like it's your birthday, but then the next you feel so sad that you want to hide in your bed until everything is over. That Friday, the day after we learned about the worldwide whispers, was a roller coaster day. After the morning register, Mrs. Khan suddenly told everyone to leave their things on their desks because we had to go to an emergency school assembly. We only ever have an emergency assembly if something bad has happened, like a fight, or if something's been stolen from a teacher. But Josie clapped her hands and asked, "Do you think they found Ahmed's parents already?" That made my heart leap up and feel like it was flying. Maybe the emergency assembly was for that. So I looked over at Ahmed and gave him an excited wave. But the assembly wasn't for that at all. Mrs. Sanders only wanted to tell everyone to be on their best behaviour, even the teachers, because the reporters surrounding the school were clearly not going anywhere anytime soon and had put the school firmly on the world's radar. Hearing this made everyone sit up straight, just in case there was a giant radar being beamed down from outer space to spy on us. Then Mrs. Sanders said that if anyone spoke to a reporter about me or Tom or Ahmed, or asked us any questions about what had happened, the police would know and they might be expelled. This made everyone turn around and stare at us, and I could hear Jenny saying loudly, "See, told you it was true. They did break into the Queen's house." And someone else reply, "They should have worn a mask, then they wouldn't have been caught." But we didn't mind. And Josie and Tom even started acting like famous people and began waving at everyone. But as we were leaving the assembly hall, Brendan the bully pushed past us and whispered, "Smelly refugee bag," at Ahmed, and Chris and Liam punched their fists into their hands, which meant they were going to beat us up. I thought we should tell Mrs. Khan and Mrs. Sanders right away, but Ahmed told me not to. He said bullies that just talk are better than bullies that actually punch, because words don't hurt as much. I don't agree. Dad always used to say that words can hurt more than punches because when you get a bruise or a bump after being punched, it disappears after a while and you can forget all about it. But words can stick around for a long time, and the meanest words stick around the longest. Tom didn't think Ahmed was right either and said we should pull down Brendan the bully's pants in PE. Josie thought we should save up all our pocket money and pay one of the bigger bullies to bully him for us. But then Michael said that bullying a bully was silly and that we should just ignore him. So that's what we all agreed to do. Except we couldn't. Because at first break, Brendan the bully started to do something which made me hate him more than anything I have ever hated in my whole life, even Beetroot and Mr. Irons. Mrs. Khan says we should never ever hate anyone because hating someone can eat up your insides and gives you heart disease. But sometimes you can't help it. And I especially couldn't help it when I heard Brendan the bully and Liam and Chris singing the song they had made up. The song went like this: "Ahmed the refugee smells like poo, so we're going to stuff him in a bag and flush him down the loo." I got so angry that as soon as I heard it, I shouted at them to shut up and leave Ahmed alone, and so did Michael and Josie and Tom, but that only made them sing it louder and louder and louder, which made Ahmed's face get redder and redder. I looked around for a teacher to tell, but Mr. Irons was the only teacher I could see on duty, and I could see right away that he had heard Brendan the bully's song too, and wasn't going to do anything about it. He just stood and watched us with his nose in the air. By the time Brendan the bully had begun to sing the song for the 4th time, I think all of us had forgotten what Mrs. Sanders had said about everyone being on their best behaviour and the giant radar and about there being lots of reporters everywhere, because suddenly, without even thinking about it, I made a running lunge for Brendan the bully, and Tom and Josie and Michael did the same. We all crashed into each other, falling to the floor, began punching and kicking Brendan the bully and Liam and Chris just as hard as we could. I think I must have been punched and kicked back too, but I was so angry I couldn't feel anything. Ahmed stood frozen to the floor and watched us, not knowing what to do, but after a few seconds he roared and, jumping on top of Brendan the bully, began to hit him as hard as he could too. The fighting didn't last for more than a minute, because a few seconds after we had all fallen to the floor, we could hear a whistle hurrying our way and clicking noises like camera buttons being pressed as lots of pairs of hands started to pull us away. We were marched into school and up the stairs, and the next thing I knew, we were all standing in Mrs. Sanders' office, being stared at angrily by not only Mrs. Sanders, but by Mrs. Khan and Mrs. Hemsey too. I couldn't really hear what they were saying because my ears had become so hot, but I think I heard the words "ashamed," "never in the history of the school," and "parents" being said. We all got a detention for fighting, even Ahmed. But it wasn't all bad. When my ears had cooled down, Josie told me that when Mrs. Sanders had heard Brendan the Bully's song, she had given him and Liam and Chris 2 weeks detention and said she would be calling their parents too. But as it turned out, Brendan the Bully's punishment was more serious than even we could have imagined, because by that very evening, Brendan the Bully and Mr. Irons were breaking the news. On every single channel and in all the weekend papers, headlines like "Video of Bully Attacking Refugee Boy Sparks Outrage," and "Teacher Stands Aside as School Bully Threatens Refugee Boy," and "School Bully Trash Talks Refugee Child" were everywhere, so that by Monday morning the school was surrounded by even more cameras and reporters and vans with satellite dishes on their roofs than before. Brendan the Bully and Liam and Chris didn't come into school for 3 whole days after they had broken the news, and when they did, their parents came with them and made them apologise to Ahmed in front of everyone at morning assembly. They still had to do detention every day for 2 weeks too. It made everyone glad they had been caught by the news people. Brendan the Bully still looked at Ahmed with a horrible scowl on his face whenever he thought no one could see him. And one time in the lunch hall, he walked right up to Ahmed with his fists clenched, as if he wanted to punch him. But instead of being scared, Ahmed just looked at him with his lion eyes and grinned. After that, Brendan the Bully never went near Ahmed again. And just when we thought things couldn't get any better, that week Mr. Irons and his whistling nose disappeared too, and were never heard of ever again. Boring Miss Stevens had to take over his class, which probably made them just as miserable as they had been before. But no one else really cared about that, because now everyone was free to scream and laugh and shout as much as they wanted to at break times again. So we did, except we all screamed and laughed and shouted louder and longer and harder than we had ever done before. Because when you're playing with your friends and don't have any bullies to worry about anymore, that's exactly what you should be doing. Chapter 24, The Interview. Although Brendan the Bully wasn't bullying Ahmed anymore and Mr. Irons was gone, I was still feeling worried. 8 whole days had passed since our emergency adventure, and Ahmed's parents still hadn't been found. And even though Mrs. Sanders had said the Queen couldn't really help us, I knew that deep down we were all still hoping she would do something. The hardest thing was trying to make Ahmed understand that the Queen hadn't been able to help. Every morning, as soon as he would see us in the playground, he would ask, "The Queen will find today, yes?" After a few days of trying to tell him no and seeing him look sad, we began to shrug and say maybe, as hopefully as we could. "The gates will have been shut last Friday," said Josie quietly, as she gave her ponytail an angry pull. Even though we didn't usually have PE on Thursdays, Mrs. Khan had decided to treat us, so we were all sitting on a bench waiting for the climbing frame and feeling sad. "Ahmed, your turn," said Tom, pointing to the free space at the climbing frame. Ahmed ran over to the bars and leapt up to the highest rung he could reach. He was as good at climbing as he was at football. When I asked him how he could jump so high and climb so fast, he shrugged and said, "Fences." "If the gates are shut already and no one's helping us to find Ahmed's family, why do you think the reporters are still here?" said Michael, carefully patting the sides of his afro so that it would stay in place when it was his turn at the climbing frame. It was a question all of us had been asking ourselves, because even though there were fewer reporters than last week, they were still all asking us questions about Ahmed whenever they saw us. "Maybe they think we'll try and do something else to help Ahmed find his family, and they're just waiting to see what it is," suggested Josie. For the rest of the day, we tried our best not to think about the reporters and the newspaper appeal and the Queen, but on the way back home, a reporter suddenly shouted out, "Kids, what do you think of Mr. Fry's views about refugee children like Ahmed?" And another one shouted, "Do you have a response? Do you want to say something back to him?" We all said no comment, just like we always did, but gave each other a puzzled look. None of us knew who Mr. Fry was, or what he had to do with us and Ahmed, but we promised each other we would try and find out that night. When I got home that afternoon, I found lots more reporters in front of my flat. It was strange because there only used to be 1 or 2 before, but now there were at least 50, and they were all shouting questions about Mr. Fry. I ran past all of them just as fast as I could and saw Mum standing just inside the main door, looking out for me. "Mum," I cried out, running up and hugging her as she quickly buzzed the door open. "You're home early." Mum hugged me back and hurried me inside. When we got to our flat, I could see the television was on, which was another sign that something odd was happening, because Mum only really watches telly at night. Quickly switching off the telly, Mum bent down to look at me closely and asked, "Are you okay? It can be scary having so many people chasing you and asking questions." I nodded. "But Mum, why are you home early?" Mum stroked my cheek before replying, because I need you to do something really important and help us all to help Ahmed. Motioning for me to sit down at the kitchen table, Mum placed a large peanut butter sandwich in front of me and a glass of milk. My stomach gave a growl because it likes peanut butter in sandwiches the best, even though they make my mouth go sticky. Darling, do you know who Mr. Fry is? He came to your school once, and a long time ago. He's our local MP. I frowned and shook my head, but the reporters were asking about him. Mum nodded. I bet they were, she said, shaking her head as she sat down opposite me. Grabbing some newspapers from the kitchen counter, she spread them out in front of me. This is why, she said. Her voice was calm, but her cheeks were pink, so I could tell she was cross about something.